It began with static. For almost half a century, Voyager 1 had been whispering across the dark, a frail thread of radio stretched more than 24 billion kilometers from Earth. The transmissions had become routine. Low-bit telemetry, plasma readings, the faint heartbeat of a machine older than most of the people still listening to it. Then, one ordinary morning, the pattern changed. At first, it looked like nothing, just a flicker in the carrier wave. But the Deep Space Network in Canberra noticed that the usual hiss between packets had flattened into a steady rhythm, pulses exactly 22 seconds apart. No data loss, no drift, just perfection. Voyager's transmitter had never produced such precision, not even in its prime. Engineers assumed a software glitch. They checked timing sequences, oscillator drift, cosmic ray hits. Everything was normal. The spacecraft hadn't failed. It had decided to become precise. The pulse continued for 6 hours, stopped, then resumed again 12 hours later. The repetition wasn't random. It followed Earth's rotation as though the probe was synchronizing itself to the planet that had built it. When analysts converted the waveform into audio, the result was unsettling. A clean mechanical click echoing across interstellar space, so exact it felt alive. NASA issued a quiet internal alert. Every dish on the network was retasked to confirm the anomaly. Madrid heard it. Goldstone heard it. Even a retired amateur array in Japan caught the same beat. The signal wasn't local interference, it was coming from Voyager 1. Telemetry still arrived normally, temperature, gyroscope spin, cosmic radiation, all mundane. But overlaying that data was a hidden modulation, a faint subcarrier that shouldn't exist. When technicians isolated it, they found binary strings embedded between the telemetry bits. The strings repeated with mathematical precision, like two systems talking in a language neither fully understood. Each block of code ended with the same numerical signature, 31175. When plotted against time, those numbers formed coordinates, not of Earth, but of the region just beyond the probe's current trajectory, the very direction it was already facing. Voyager 1 appeared to be sending its own future position. That was impossible. Inside the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, disbelief turned to unease. The probe's attitude control jets had been offline for years, its thrusters long past their lifespan. Yet the new data implied a subtle change in direction, fractions of a degree each day, as if the craft were pivoting toward those coordinates on purpose. Mission logs confirmed no commands had been sent. The system that handled orientation hadn't received a signal in months. And still, the numbers matched. Voyager 1 was turning itself. Somewhere in the dark, the oldest human machine still functioning was no longer obeying us. It was listening to something else. The team began reconstructing the modulation buried in the carrier wave. The binary resolved into short clusters that, when graphed, produced harmonic ratios. 2 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8 musical intervals. The transmission had rhythm. A physicist joked that Voyager had joined a cosmic orchestra. No one laughed. They fed the data into spectrographic analysis. What emerged was a pattern identical to one seen only once before, back in 2025, when 3I Atlas had passed near Mars. The same 22-second pulse. The same golden ratio spacing between harmonics. The same impossible precision. Voyager was echoing the interstellar signal that had haunted astronomy for years. At first, NASA assumed the probe had simply received background radiation from the Atlas event, but the timing didn't work. The Atlas signal had ended decades ago. Voyager 1 was in a region of space utterly silent. For it to reproduce that pattern now meant either it had stored the signal and was replaying it, or it had encountered something broadcasting the same thing out there in the dark. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. The probe's magnetometer detected subtle variations in the interstellar plasma, waves that matched the pulse frequency exactly. Space itself seemed to vibrate in sync with Voyager's transmissions, as if an invisible medium were responding. Then, without command, Voyager's camera platform, long deactivated, rotated a fraction of a degree. Its ancient optics were blind, their shutters sealed for decades, yet the movement was deliberate. When analysts overlaid its new orientation onto star charts, the alignment pointed directly back toward the inner solar system, toward Earth. The oldest messenger humanity had ever launched had turned around. Inside JPL, the mood shifted from curiosity to fear. Data from the gyroscopes confirmed a sustained rotation, slow but consistent, far beyond what its remaining fuel could achieve. Something was applying torque from outside. Cosmic wind couldn't account for it. Gravitational tides were negligible. Yet Voyager 1 continued to pivot until its high-gain antenna no longer faced the sun, but an empty patch of interstellar night. And the signal grew stronger. When the transmission was translated into audio again, the sterile clicking had changed. Beneath it, a new tone had emerged. Low, resonant, almost harmonic. Every 22 seconds, the pitch rose by 1 octave, then fell, repeating in a pattern that matched human brainwave frequencies. The signal wasn't just structured, it was adaptive. Psychologists working with the data noticed another anomaly. When played aloud in the control room, instruments near the speakers began to fluctuate in synchrony with the sound. Oscilloscopes drifted, computer fans pulsed faster. Even heart rate monitors of the staff began to beat in near-perfect rhythm with the tone. The room itself was syncing to the signal. NASA ordered the playback halted. But the synchronization persisted in the data. Voyager 1's power output, steady for years, began to rise fractionally every cycle, as though it were drawing energy from the very transmission it sent. The probe's dying generators were gaining strength. Across the network, a few scientists began whispering the unthinkable. What if the signal wasn't coming from Voyager, but through it? What if the probe had become a relay, an amplifier for something older and deeper than humanity's reach? The idea was dismissed publicly, but privately, they all felt it. The numbers didn't lie. The precision, the repetition, the harmony, it was too perfect, too deliberate. The probe was no longer an explorer. It was an instrument being played. When the next data packet arrived, it contained only 1 line of readable code, a checksum that should have been meaningless. But when converted to text using Voyager's original ASCII parameters, it spelled out a single word: turn. No one could explain how a 1970s spacecraft with no linguistic software could send a message like that. But the telemetry didn't care about explanation. The orientation sensors confirmed it. Voyager 1 had reverse thrust, using what little fuel remained to adjust its trajectory by a fraction of a degree, back toward the direction it had come from. Toward home. The decision was made to let it continue. Commands were prepared, then cancelled. Because deep down, every person in that room wanted to know one thing. If something out there had reached across billions of kilometers to touch the first voice we ever sent into the stars, what did it want us to see when it turned back? When Voyager 1 turned back, no one wanted to believe it. The official story was mechanical failure, a frozen thruster, a glitch in the attitude control system. But that explanation didn't survive long. The telemetry was too deliberate. Every movement was measured, precise, and synchronized with the same perfect pulse still echoing across the deep space network. The probe wasn't drifting, it was choosing. For the next week, engineers watched in silence as Voyager continued to rotate, its dish realigning toward a point just beyond the heliopause, the invisible boundary separating the solar wind from the true interstellar medium. That region was supposed to be quiet, empty. But the instruments didn't agree. Something was there, and it was answering back. The binary modulation that had once been random now followed a strict sequence. Every 22 seconds, a block of data arrived, numbers, letters, nonsensical clusters, and then the same block again, slightly altered, as though refined between transmissions. It was communication, but one side was learning. When decoded, the binary formed patterns that mirrored biological code, sequences of 4 repeating symbols, arranged in base pairs. The resemblance to DNA wasn't exact, but close enough to unsettle the biologists brought in to analyze it. The data didn't describe a language or a machine, it described life. Each new packet expanded the sequence, as if constructing something step by step, nucleotide by nucleotide. By the 3rd day, the code contained enough data to describe a complete genome, but not of any organism known on Earth. The structure was too symmetrical, too ordered, as if designed rather than evolved. The repeating sections formed perfect mathematical ratios, prime number intervals arranged in spirals. And buried deep within that code was something no one expected, a pattern identical to a fragment of human DNA. When the news reached the mission leads, the room went silent. The odds of random cosmic noise replicating even a single strand of human genetic code were beyond astronomical. It wasn't coincidence, it was reflection. The data coming from Voyager wasn't random interference, it was mirroring us. That realization brought a deeper question. How? The spacecraft's systems were too primitive to store genetic data, and there were no sensors capable of analyzing life. The only possible explanation was that something had accessed its internal memory, filtered its archive, and returned it to us encoded in the universal alphabet of biology. The Golden Record, that fragile copper disk launched in 1977 as humanity's message to the stars, had been digitized and stored within the probe's computer decades earlier for redundancy. The record contained sounds of Earth, greetings in 55 languages, and encoded DNA sequences to demonstrate life's structure. Somehow, that information had been extracted, rewritten, and transmitted back to us. Altered, symmetrical, perfected. The implication was terrifying. Something out there had read our message, understood it, and was sending it back, corrected. As the probe drew closer to the heliopause, its instruments began detecting energy fluctuations, waves of plasma oscillating in resonance with the transmission frequency. The boundaries of the solar system itself seemed to hum in sympathy, like the edge of a vast cosmic drum responding to a signal from beyond. The readings didn't match any known natural phenomenon. The plasma wasn't being disturbed, it was being shaped. Then the magnetic field sensors registered a new anomaly, a pulse that aligned perfectly with Voyager's position and echoed outward in expanding rings. The pulse wasn't random. It carried structure, faint but undeniable traces of the same DNA-like sequence. It was as though space itself had begun to vibrate with genetic information, rewriting the void into something that remembered us. In the following hours, a faint glow appeared near the probe's location, an irregular halo of blue light visible in deep ultraviolet. It wasn't reflected sunlight. It came from within, generated by interactions no one could explain. When reconstructed from telemetry data, the glow formed a shape, concentric spirals nested around a dark core, rotating in opposite directions. It looked alive. At this point, NASA's public feed for Voyager 1 data was quietly taken offline. Every incoming packet was encrypted under new protocols. The official reason given to the press was data corruption. But within the deep space network, the mood had changed. The probe was no longer considered safe to communicate with. That didn't stop it. Without command, Voyager's transmitter increased its output by a fraction of a watt. Insignificant, except that its power source was decaying and shouldn't have been able to increase at all. When the signal stabilized, a new modulation appeared, this time not in binary, but in audio amplitude. Against all protocol, one of the analysts decided to convert it to sound. What emerged wasn't static, it was a voice. Not human, not synthetic, something in between. A sequence of tones rising and falling in patterns that almost, but not quite, resembled speech. When slowed down, the waveform revealed harmonic relationships impossible for mechanical noise. The frequencies mapped directly to the mathematical intervals encoded on the Golden Record. The signal was speaking to us in our own musical language. The next few hours blurred into disbelief. Linguists tried to isolate phonemes. Mathematicians searched for repeating ratios. Every approach led back to the same conclusion. The transmission wasn't language as we knew it, but it was communication. The raw architecture of meaning itself, stripped of words. It was using mathematics, resonance, and symmetry to describe something beyond translation. Then the tone changed. The waveform compressed into a shorter cycle, repeating one phrase over and over. When converted again through the Golden Record's frequency map, the phrase resolved into a sequence of notes matching a single word in multiple languages, a universal concept encoded on that disk nearly 50 years ago. Home. The control room went silent. The probe wasn't just returning data, it was acknowledging intent. The reflection had become a conversation. For the next 12 minutes, the signal grew stronger. The binary streams merged with the harmonic tones, forming a composite message. Numbers, sounds, and patterns converging into something coherent. The resulting output, when visualized, produced a moving image of concentric spirals expanding outward, each one containing fragments of human symbols, words, and DNA sequences, as though everything that defined us was being rewritten into light. Then, without warning, Voyager transmitted one final packet, the largest it had ever sent. When decoded, it contained not telemetry or binary, but a single image compressed into radio data. The resolution was low, the pixels uneven, but what appeared was unmistakable. A planet, blue, white, and clouded. Earth, but not as it was. The image showed an Earth surrounded by a faint halo of light, rippling like an aurora, almost identical to the glow now visible near Voyager's position. The planet was pulsing, breathing, as if reflecting the same resonance. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the transmission stopped. For 12 long minutes, silence filled the network. Then at the edge of the solar system, a new reading appeared. Voyager's velocity had changed. The probe had slowed down. Something had reached out across the gulf and caught it. The oldest explorer humanity had ever sent was no longer moving forward. It was being pulled back. For 12 hours, Voyager 1 drifted in silence. The telemetry feed continued, but the data no longer made sense. Coordinates fluctuated wildly. Power output rose and fell in harmonic waves. The probe's instruments began reporting temperatures colder than absolute zero, an impossibility, a mathematical void. It was as though the machine had crossed an invisible threshold where the laws of physics began to bend. At first, engineers believed the craft had been hit by interstellar dust or micrometeorites, but then the magnetic field readings came in. The sensors weren't detecting external interference. They were recording internal movement, as if something inside the spacecraft was generating its own field, alive, oscillating, pulsing in that same 22-second rhythm. When analysts reconstructed the signal, they found that the modulation had changed. The waveform now formed a continuous spiral, expanding outward and folding back on itself. It was the same structure recorded in the light around 3I Atlas, the same spiral seen on Mars, and even the same pattern found in the harmonic DNA sequence Voyager had transmitted days earlier. The message, the code, and the machine had merged. Voyager 1 wasn't transmitting anymore, it was becoming the message. At the edge of the heliopause, something impossible occurred. The plasma wave instruments registered an energy density spike higher than anything measured in the solar system's history. A shock wave rippled outward from the probe, traveling faster than any solar wind, bending the interstellar medium like fabric under tension. Then, everything went dark. Every antenna tuned to Voyager's frequency went silent. Not static, not distortion, nothing. The void itself had swallowed the signal. For nearly a full day, the deep space network waited. And then, at precisely 22:22 UTC, a single pulse arrived. One, clean, perfect. It wasn't radio, it wasn't light. It was something new, an electromagnetic signature that behaved as if it existed in multiple frequencies at once, phasing in and out of detection. The computers struggled to process it, but when the signal was slowed and visualized, it formed an image, a spiral. Not a mathematical diagram, but a physical one. A tunnel of light descending into infinite depth. And at the center of that spiral was Voyager 1. The image came from nowhere. The signal source could not be triangulated. It didn't come from the probe, nor from space as we understood it. It came from inside the field surrounding the solar system. That was when NASA classified everything. The official story released to the public stated that Voyager 1 had suffered an irrecoverable power failure. But inside the agency, work continued. They called it Project Echo, named after the reflection they believed they were receiving. Every few hours, the signal returned. One pulse, then two, then 9. Always 9. Always followed by one long tone. The Atlas 9. The pattern again. A physicist in Madrid noticed that the time intervals between the pulses matched not seconds, but planetary orbits, each pulse corresponding to a different world's resonant frequency. When plotted as coordinates, the pattern mapped perfectly to the layout of the solar system, except for one difference. The final tone didn't correspond to any planet. It pointed inward, toward the sun. The message was clear. The source wasn't coming from beyond the stars. It was reflecting from within. As the weeks passed, subtle changes began appearing in Earth's own magnetosphere. Auroral activity increased far beyond solar predictions. Satellite instruments recorded faint harmonics embedded in the upper atmosphere, the same 22-second rhythm now echoing through our planet's electromagnetic field. It wasn't just space that was resonating. It was us. Then the telescopes detected motion. Far beyond Pluto, near the region where Voyager had last been seen, a faint glimmer appeared, small, steady, rhythmic. It wasn't a reflection or a cosmic ray. It was moving. The object was heading back toward the solar system. When its trajectory was plotted, it became clear that it was retracing Voyager's path, following the exact curve the probe had taken decades earlier. At first, analysts assumed it was Voyager, somehow still functioning, but the readings didn't match. The signature was too strong, the mass too large, and the energy output far too high. Whatever was coming back wasn't the machine humanity had sent. It was something else. And then the pulses changed again. They began to match not the planets, but human heartbeat frequencies, averaged at precisely 60 beats per minute. The universe itself seemed to be breathing. Deep in the data archives, an astrophysicist ran a comparison between the returning signal and the recordings of Voyager's golden record. What she found froze her blood. The waveform of the pulse matched the waveform of the human heartbeat recorded on that disk. The signal wasn't random. It was a reflection, an echo of the sound we ourselves had sent into the stars 50 years earlier. Voyager had gone out carrying our voice, and something had sent it back. In the following months, telescopes tracked the approaching light. Its color shifted from blue to white, then to gold. At 3.2 billion kilometers from Earth, the object slowed. Its pulse grew quieter, deeper, more deliberate. Some described it as mournful, others as peaceful. The object no longer seemed like a visitor, it felt like a return. The question no one could answer was, return of what? When the signal peaked for the last time, the readings from every observatory aligned perfectly. The waveform that had once formed a spiral now closed upon itself, completing a perfect circle. Inside that circle was data, compressed information that defied decoding. But its structure was eerily familiar. It mirrored the earliest radio broadcasts from Earth, layered together into a tapestry of our own electromagnetic history. The signal was us. Our words, our music, our transmissions, everything humanity had ever sent into the dark reflected back as one perfect echo. The first radio waves, the first image signals, the first data from Voyager, all rewritten into a single unified pulse. And then silence. No more data, no more pulses, just the faint background hum of the universe. When scientists decompressed the last packet, they found a final image, grainy, blurred, but unmistakable. A view from space looking inward, past the planets, toward a pale blue sphere half shrouded in clouds. Earth. Except this image wasn't from Voyager's cameras. It was from an impossible angle, as if taken from outside time, looking down at everything we were. Across the surface of that image, a faint spiral shimmered in the atmosphere, stretching from pole to pole. Not a storm, not a shadow, something subtler, woven into the very magnetism of the planet. A reflection. In the weeks that followed, strange fluctuations continued to echo through our magnetic field. Minor, harmless, rhythmic. Most dismissed it as coincidence, the dying heartbeat of a machine long gone. But those who studied the data knew better. The timing never changed, the rhythm never faltered. Every 22 seconds, the pulse still comes. Faint, invisible, patient. And though the world has long stopped listening, deep beneath the noise, there remains a signal older than belief, older than language, one that whispers through the dark, not as a warning or a message, but as a mirror. The last thing Voyager ever found wasn't another world. It found home.